Names are important. They're how we refer to each other, how we identify each other. But they can also sometimes tell us profound things about a person. Often names have deep meanings, which tells us something about that person. People used to get last names based off their job, like Mason or Baker. But our first names can have meanings as well. Take me for an example. The name Tamsin is actually a short form of the Aramaic name Thomasina, which means twin. And I'm actually a twin. Whilst my parents didn't mean to do this, it is pretty cool. A more meaningful look at this idea is what we see in Saul in the New Testament. After choosing to follow Jesus, Saul starts going by the name Paul, which means little or small. He chose to throw away his life of luxury to become a servant for Christ, making himself small and little before Christ. Coming to the passage today, which we had read earlier, Exodus 3 verses 1 to 17, we're going to see God reveal himself on a mountain. And he's going to reveal two things about himself: his great plan and his great name. If you've been traveling along with us in our reading plan, you might know what's happening in this passage. Exodus opens with God's people, Israel, being trapped in slavery in Egypt. The Pharaoh, he felt threatened by Israel, resulting in this guy called Moses, who was born an Israelite and grew up an Egyptian. Moses had to flee Egypt. Moses then ends up going to a foreign country and getting married. And this is where the passage opens up, with Moses tending to his father-in-law's sheep. Whilst tending to these sheep, Moses comes to the mountain of God, which is called Mount Horeb. Already we see the importance of this mountain. It's literally known as the mountain of God. And this mountain actually becomes really important later on, also being known as Mount Sinai, being the place where God will later give Moses the 10 Commandments. So this is a pretty important mountain. So we have Moses. He's walking up to the mountain, and what does he see? He sees a bush on fire, but it isn't burning. See, when a bush or leaves burn, you would normally expect this to happen. But the bush doesn't do this. It doesn't crackle or diminish. It doesn't get burned. It doesn't get charred. The bush is fine. Imagine if you saw this. How would you react? Tell me in the comments what your first reaction would be. I'll give you a couple seconds. I think at first I'd be a bit confused, but also a bit scared. But then I think I'd get a bit curious. And we see this curiosity in Moses as he goes to investigate. Now, what is so special or weird about this bush? I want you to tell me again. What do you think is really special about this bush? Why isn't it getting consumed by the fire? I can't see your answers, but hopefully some of you got it. God is inside this bush. The fire is an image of God's power in how it does not burn the bush. And it also shows his holiness. And Moses sees this truth. Look at the reverence, which basically means deep respect, that Moses gives to God. Unlike in previous interactions that we've seen on mountains, Moses takes off his shoes as it is holy ground, because God's presence was right there in the bush. Moses hides his face in fear. God's presence is so glorious that Moses is bowing down, turning his face away and keeping his distance. These three actions all show us that Moses knows he is in the presence of a divine and powerful God. And from this bush, God reveals two things: his great plan and his great name. We see in verse 4 that God knows Moses. He even calls Moses by his name. And God then goes on to identify himself by his relationship to many big names in Israel's history. He says he's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This isn't a new God, but it's the same God that has taken care and promised many things to Israel. You see, in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, God promises several things to Abraham and Israel. For them to multiply, to get land, and to be God's holy people, among a lot of other promises. But many in Israel had lost hope in God fulfilling these promises because they were in slavery. But here God tells Moses he has seen their misery. Look at verse 7. And he is the same God that made the promises, and he will fulfill them. And we see this in what his great plan is. Look at verses 7 to 10. I have seen the misery of my people. I've heard them crying out, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I come down to rescue them and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. God reveals to Moses that he plans to come down from the mountain and save the Israelites and bring them out of their suffering to fulfill the promises he made to Abraham. What an awesome picture this is. If you are a slave, to hear God hasn't forgotten about you. He hasn't forgotten the promises he made, and he's going to free you from your chains. How amazing is that? So how is God going to do this? Well, he tells Moses. He says, so now, go. I am sending you to the Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. He will save Israel through Moses. Moses, the Israelite that ran away, is the one that God will send back to set Israel free. But why is he going to free them? God tells us that as well. Look at verse 12. God says he is saving Israel to worship him on this very mountain. God's plan is to save Israel for himself, to worship as he is worthy of worship. God doesn't only reveal his great plan though. He reveals his great plan in the lead up to the biggest revelation in this passage, his great name. When Moses asks who he should say sent him to the Israelite elders, God answers in a pretty confusing way. God says, I am who I am. Okay, hold up. What does that even mean? That's not a name. Shouldn't a name be something like Steve or Jackie? Not I am who I am? It may seem random to refer to himself with a phrase, but it actually reveals some really important things about God. First, it reveals he has no equal. He is the only God, and he can call himself this because it can't refer to any other gods. I am who I am. It also shows us that this is his name forever. God does not change. Like earlier when he tells Moses that he is the God of Israel's ancestors, he is the same God then, he is the same God in this passage, and he is the same God now, and he will always be the same God. I am who I am. It shows us that God isn't limited in identity like we are. We have our identity in a job or a relationship or a first name. We have a birth and a death. But God is different. He was not created, he just always is. There was never a time when he didn't exist or will not exist. Unlike babies who are named at the time of their birth or creation, God always is, always was, and always will be. God is able to say, I am who I am. And this statement from God actually becomes super important as it forms the letters of the name that Israel will go on to give God. Yahweh, which means the great I am. And it is with this name that God sends Moses to Israel. In verse 14 he says, tell them I am has sent you. So God reveals his great plan and his great name to Moses. But what does this mean for us? Well, this great plan and this great name point us to God's great plan for the whole world, not just Israel. The rescue of the nation of Israel from slavery points us to a greater rescue, the rescue of every nation from the slavery of sin. And God has done this through another great name. Can you guess what that is? Maybe have a quick guess in the comments. Well, it's the name Jesus. God reveals even more of his plan, his nature and his name in Jesus. Jesus' name itself declares that. The name Jesus is actually Yeshua in Hebrew. And you know what Yeshua means? It means Yahweh is salvation. Did you catch that? Yahweh, the name that Israel calls God, is salvation. Israel knows that God saved them, but the name Yeshua shows that Yahweh isn't finished yet. Yahweh will bring salvation to more people through Jesus, not just Israel, but all the nations. It is in Jesus that God's final plan for salvation comes into play, with Jesus' death on the cross. Jesus also goes one step further as he talks about his death in John 13, verse 19. Jesus says to his followers, "Now I tell you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am who I am." Isn't that amazing? Jesus makes a huge statement. He is saying, I am who I am. He's saying Yahweh and I are one. And by saying this, Jesus is declaring himself to be God. The God that has all the characteristics of the name I am who I am. No beginning, no end, no equal, holy and worthy of worship and praise. That is Jesus. All these characteristics are Jesus because Jesus is Yahweh, and he is worthy of the same glory as the God that Moses met on the mountain. Jesus shows us God's greater plan, and his death is a crucial part of this plan. His death pays the price of our freedom, allowing all of us to leave the slavery of sin. And it frees us to worship God together as his people. Through Moses, God saved Israel, but God has saved all nations through Jesus. What a wonderful plan. How have you responded to the plan of God? Do you see God as worthy of your worship and reverence like Moses? Do you give this worship to Jesus? Moses saw God on Mount Horeb, and he worshipped God, and he heard God's great plan and God's great name. Moses listened and obeyed. Today, Jesus speaks to us as God. Jesus tells us of God's great plan and his great name. Names, they have a great significance. And I think the name of Jesus is the one with the most significance. Yahweh is salvation. I am is salvation.